Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Educatedcollins Snap Channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be trying to cover the Conquest meta for June, at least this first week. It's been a pretty exciting, I guess, week, just kind of looking through, trying to experiment, figure out what's really good, really working in Conquest. It's not like too different from Ranked in terms of what decks you're seeing, but there's less, I guess, flexibility in the list just because you have to be dealing with multiple opponents. And because you're dealing with multiple opponents, your decks need to consistently do well. Even if you have a deck that can win some of the time, if it can't win 2 in a row, 3 in a row, it doesn't really fully work in Conquest. So that's some of the things. So we'll just be going through just kind of the meta tier list, my thoughts on it, and just kind of giving you an overview for like here are some decks to play essentially. So let's get started. So there are going to be some initial thoughts and discussions about the overall deck list. Generally, some of the things that I have already talked about a little bit, but it's generally hard to make like fancy lists or new lists because you have to deal with the meta. And the meta is mostly high evolutionary with a sprinkling of like high evolutionary attempted counters and just other viable meta decks in there. So if you're trying to do some new tech, some new deck lists, it's hard because you're going to go up against a meta composition in the 2 or 3 runs you're playing, and if you can't beat those meta compositions, your deck doesn't work. So because of that, it's hard to really make fancy lists. A lot of the lists here are going to be something you're familiar with, something you've seen before, because that's generally what's working. Another thing, due to the prevalence of Hulk, High Evolutionary Hulk, and just generally big point slam decks, Shang-Chi is pretty much everywhere. This is something you want to be paying attention to, even if you're not playing those particular lists. You always pretty much have to be thinking about Shang-Chi turn 6 as a viable option. So if you're looking at your hand, you're like, okay, I'm playing this, but it leads me to Shang-Chi. At least be aware that it's a possibility that, oh, okay, I do this, I have to think about getting Shang-Chi next turn. So it's just due to the meta. Shang-Chi's in like every list, so that's not like a combo deck. So you have to be aware of that and just keep doing your game plan. And the third thing is just a general conquest tip. I generally think if you are comfortable with your deck and you think you're favored, it's preferable to spend your early turns learning your opponent's deck instead of like snapping and trying to like steal 8 cubes. If your deck is a combo deck and is something that can surprise them, then I do recommend snapping. But a lot of these lists that we're going to be showing are not weak, right? They're pretty strong, pretty comfortable. So if you can just figure out what your opponent's doing, then you can generally like grind them out. So there's no need to try to go for an early 8 cube or anything like that. That's really more if you just want to surprise them with like maybe like a Modok Heled list or something like that, and then get a free 8 win, and it's a lot easier to win from there. All right, let's get into the list. First list obviously is going to be maybe the most prevalent deck. It's the High Evolutionary Lockjaw. This one just is ubiquitous in the meta. Lockjaw, really powerful to get one of your bombs out early. Hulk, Infinite. You have the Chavez for consistency. And then Dracula, Jubilee also lets you get some big stuff out. And if you don't hit the Lockjaw, at least you have the Thor, Jane as a secondary win condition. So there's a lot of power here to kind of get you going. So this is really probably the most common deck list, and it's definitely something you can play. A lot of people are trying to find counters for this deck, and it's sad because there isn't like a guaranteed counter. There's like little techs you can do putting rocks in or just having Shang-Chi. This is the reason why Shang-Chi's in everything. But it still just works. It still wins games. So it's just a hard deck to really deal with, and it's definitely a big part of the meta. Next list is also a high evolutionary list. Those are the two most common, in my opinion, decks that you'll be seeing. This is a high evolutionary control list. So this one, instead of going for the big Lockjaw end game, you're just locking your opponents out. Something very common is if one of the other lanes or one of the three lanes has a lockdown mechanic, it becomes very easy for this deck to win because you storm one lane and you Spider-Man the other, and then your opponent can't do anything turn 6, which gives you a lot of freedom. So this is definitely an annoying list, definitely a strong list. Makes a lot of people rage just because they can't really find answers to it. But yeah, definitely a good list to play if you want. You could definitely switch Jeff for one of these cards. I guess I should have put that in there, right? Like I could maybe put like, I don't know, DareDevil for Jeff. Honestly, the list is decent even without Jeff. You don't need it, so I don't mind it here. All right, next up here is Falcon Bounce. This has been a very popular tech answer to a lot of the high evolutionary stuff. You have the Shang-Chi, of course, is and everything, and then Iron Man is the tech to get over these Hulk decks. With Iron Man, you can kind of be bigger than some of the other point slams here, since you can just scale a lot with Hitmonkey, you can scale a lot with Angel and Bishop, and Kitty Pryde, of course. So you just get a lot of ways to go over the top of some of these point slime decks. Definitely a nice list. There's a lot of tech options, a lot of ways to really make sure you're going big and wide. The one thing is you don't really need Jeff. That's more of a tech choice. But you could definitely just play Falcon instead if you don't want to add Jeff into your list. So this is definitely something viable that you can play if you want to. And the decks I would say are like the strongest that I talk about first, and then as we go, it's like progressively more niche, I would say. So these are still in like very strong territory. And then next up is another like Hitmonkey-ish Kitty Pryde deck. It's Hitmonkey Sera. So this one is a little bit more controlling. You are relying on the Sera instead of the Iron Man, and you just kind of pop off in the final turn. Obviously, wave can mess you up, but there's not that much waving, I would say. Some decks do still run it, but a lot of times you don't get hit by it, and you can still just do your tech as you want. So this is definitely another option. You have a little bit more counter tools, a little bit more control. So it's definitely a way to play out the end games. And then Scarlet Witch and Sentinel aren't necessarily needed if you want to run Jeff, if you want to run Lizard or whatever, you can definitely do it like that. Next up is Jeff Stature. So this one is still pretty common. This is like a good answer to the Lockjaw, in that you are just running a ton of rocks everywhere. Cog goes down, Rock Slide goes down, and then you just have a lot of points in the final turn if you can get the bolt down. And Black Bolt can be pretty nice because you can hit the Thor hammers if they go Jane on 5, and you follow up with the Black Bolt, you can get rid of their hammer. So that could be a nice option. And of course you have the Shang-Chi and everything. So it's just a nice little tech tool. It's a strong deck, but it has some options into the metagame that makes it particularly useful. Next up, we have Patriot Lad. So this is a deck I made a video about recently, where you are really utilizing the Iron Lad to give you the engine into the Patriot shell. A lot of good hits. The Shang-Chi is just a tech into the Lockjaw matchup, and then you just have a lot of little tips and tricks. Invisible Woman is nice for just kind of hiding your game plan sometimes, and just like making sure that they aren't fully aware exactly what you're doing. And then there's a lot of tech there. You don't necessarily need to be running Debris or Iron Man, so you could definitely replace some of that for Wave, Killmonger, Luke Cage, depending on what you think is more prevalent in the metagame. So there's definitely some tech into this. This is a pretty flexible list. It's definitely a harder list to pilot than some of the other ones, so you do have to know what you're doing, but I mean, almost every list, I think, except for like the top, are become hard to pilot once you have to account for a lot of different things. Next up, we have discard. So discard's still pretty strong. It always seems to get like ignored or at least not talked about, but then it's just like its stats are always solid, and discard in Conquest is no different. So you just drop a Dracula, you drop a Modork, and then you just have a ton of power on the final turns. There were some strategies with people running Storm and stuff, but right now I wouldn't really put Storm in any non like heavy control list, because people, if you storm and they storm, then they Spider-Man you. So you just don't get to play that final turn. So if you can avoid adding storm in your list, I think that's more preferable, because you're going to be playing people that are going to storm you already. So here we have the Iceman. You could definitely run Nebula if you want, instead of Sunspot or Iceman, just to have a little bit more of a reach there. So it's not a too big of an investment. So definitely a good list, still strong, and definitely recommend it if you like this card. Next up, we have Sera Surfer. So Sera Surfer just is a fun list to play. A lot of tech tools. This one runs Dazzler. There's definitely others that run like Storm and stuff. But once again, right, I wouldn't really add Storm for the same reasons, right? They Spider-Man you on 5 if you double Storm. But Dazzler still works pretty well here. It's a lot easier to play in nowadays with the changes. So you could definitely have it running. Shadow King does do some work into a lot of matchups, since people are playing Nebula, people are playing Sandman, and just scaling units. So you can definitely shut it down a little bit there. So that's a little bit nice. But generally, it's more of a just do your own thing. You play Sera on 5, and then you pop off on the final turn. Goose is a nice tech as well to kind of mess with people trying to control you. So there's a lot of good positives for this particular deck. And if you don't have Jeff, you can play Nova. So that one's not too big of a downside. Next up, we have Electro Ramp. I gotta say, for this list, like, I looked at it, and I don't fully get the Black Widow. Like, I think you could play other things, but like, this one was what, like, I haven't played this deck, right? So this one was like, okay, Black Widow is like in all the good lists. I don't really, maybe someone would tell me, okay, Black Widow is here because of etc. But I don't fully get it. Maybe it's for like Dracula tech. You could go like wave. I honestly, I don't know. So maybe someone in the chat would be like, "Hey, Collins, thanks. This is my time to shine. Black Widow's here because of blah blah blah." But generally, like, it's still a Electro Ramp. You Electro into Sandman into whatever, or Electro into Black Panther into Zola into whatever. So there's just a lot of like big power you can slam, and so generally, it's still a good deck. Very reliable. You have the Chavez for consistency, so not a particularly bad list at all. So definitely something you can run if you like this type of deck. It's definitely one of the easier decks to pilot, since it's pretty telegraphed, right? Electro wave into something else, right? So if you like that, feel free. Next up, we have a Destroy deck, Thanos Destroy. I like this one the most out of the Destroy packages. There's definitely a number of Destroy decks going around. So there's one without Thanos. I didn't really showcase it in here, but I do want to mention that this isn't like the only Destroy deck you can run. You can definitely run a non-Thanos version. But this one I do think has the most upside, in that you do get a lot of easy targets with the stones, and then you can just like have a lot of activators for your death and your null, and you still get to run Shang-Chi and everything. So definitely a solid list. Destroy is decent. It sometimes struggles to get over the top of a very big decks like the Lockjaw, and sometimes struggles against the Lockdown as well. So there are some noticeable weaknesses, but it's still a fun list. Still has a lot of good potential, and you could definitely do well with it. So recommend it. Next up, we have Wong Ongoing. This is maybe the most like solitaire of the lists, where you just kind of you hope to do what you want, and then hope your opponent doesn't have an answer. You do play Wong into Black Panther Zola, or Wong into Tiger, Doctor Doom, or anything like that. If you have any ramp, then you can go Odin, you can go Doctor Doom. So there's a lot of power in this lane, and that's really what it's hoping for. Obviously, Maybe the issue with this deck is that it loses to control lists, in that if they Spider-Man you, then you can't do your turn 6, right? So that's maybe the biggest weakness, right? Like, even though people aren't running Cosmo, which is normally what it is, people are still running ways to mess with your Wong, right? Magneto is also kind of interesting tech that people are running now. So you can also get magnetoed on the final turn. So you do have to be careful with it. I wouldn't say it's like super reliable, but there are some good opportunities to do a lot of damage with this card. So I want to mention that. All right, next up we have Gamora Move. This is, I believe, from Moltz. Moltz is in every move deck. But this is like the new hotness. Probably his fault promoting it, but it's not doing bad in stats anyways. There's no Heimdall, which is definitely interesting, but I do think in Conquest you don't that like actually benefits you, because they don't know for sure that you don't have a Heimdall, so you can kind of get away with like people assuming you're gonna Heimdall and then you do other things. So there are some benefits in Conquest for doing something not standard, because if you see a move deck, you're always thinking Heimdall. So by not running the Heimdall, you're making them play about something that might not exist, right? So you can actually get away with um, them playing in a way that you don't particularly understand. So you can get some easy cubes by doing that, subverting expectations. I definitely like decks like that. So this is definitely one that can do that for sure. So gotta keep that in mind and make sure you take advantage of it. This does run the Storm. I did mention some of the weaknesses of Storm, but I think it's fine in this particular list. You can still move things around, so it's not the worst. All right, and then next up we have just like regular DareDevil Control. So if you don't have High Evolutionary, you still want to play a version of Control, this is definitely something that can work for you. And the stats aren't like super bad. Obviously, I think the High Evolutionary deck version is better, but if you don't have that, you just want to do something else different, this one still works. You are running Gamora and still a lot of the control tools with Spider-Man, Professor X. You have the Miles Morales for a little bit more of a point slam engine with the Nightcrawler and the Polaris, and then you just have the Chavez for consistency. So definitely an interesting list that can definitely work out, and feel free to run it if you want to. And then next up, I believe we're nearing the end of these. Here we have Shuri. So Shuri's not like a super popular list ever since the nerf, but it still has some good some good tools to win. I would say like its biggest weakness right now is that everyone's running Shang-Chi. Everyone's running Shang-Chi, right? So you have to have like some way of protecting your unit. Either you run armor or you buff up the vision and not have priority. It's easier to not have priority with this deck, to be fair, but you do have to be careful, because if you are lazing around Red Skull into nothing, you'll just get Shang-Chi and then lose, right? Because your Taskmaster won't hit anything, so it can be pretty bad. You do have the She-Hulk as well for another way to do well, right? If you want to not have priority, you can pass and then She-Hulk and play a 5. So there is definitely some lines here that are a lot safer, but if you are just autopiloting, not really paying attention, you'll just get smacked by the Shang-Chi that everyone's running. So you do have to keep that in mind. And then the last list we have is Dino. Now, it's the last list not because I think these are the only lists that work, but these are the ones I felt like generally comfortable recommending, because there's like other lists like junk and stuff, but I really don't think they're like doing well enough to recommend the meta. There's also like Nebula lists that are negative lists that are doing well and stuff like that. But these are the ones that I wanted to go through. I definitely know sometimes I put too many options for people, but generally Collector Dino Darkhawk version also works. But this is the one I think is more prevalent. If you are running Darkhawk, it's usually like a Jeff Stature list. But Dino still has some big ways to get above people. You can definitely just um, play a big Dino for 5 and then like buff it up in the final turns. So this one does rely on Collector a little bit more than other Dino lists, and you do have Angela and Kitty Pryde. Kitty Pryde just being a nice tool for consistently getting power and power and power and power. So definitely a good list if you want to run it, and a lot of fun. This is a fun list because you are adding a lot of random cards in your hand with the Maria Hill, with the Ancient Coulson, and the Agent 13. So there's a lot of unique scenarios you can put yourself in that your opponent might not be expecting with a list like this. So overall, those are the current meta Conquest list for June. Unfortunately, there's not anything fancy in here. I don't want to recommend a fancy list that's hard to play and then you just fall flat on your face because you can't beat like Jane Lockjaw, right? So that's kind of the issue, but hopefully maybe Second Dinner will nerf or buff some things to make a little bit more viability. It's not that you can't run other things. It's just that you always have to be aware of like, hey, I'm going to be fighting a high evolutionary list at some point. So I just keep that in mind. Hope you guys learned something, found a new deck to play, or just or I just like, yeah, high evolutionary is good. You can still play that, which is the meta. But other than that, take care of yourselves. Hope you guys enjoy this and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Educatedcollins snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be